This documentary examines how World War II Germany selected and trained crews for its submarine service as a historical case study. It does not endorse Nazi ideology, and it does not glorify the war. The purpose here is clarity, not admiration, to understand what a wartime system demanded from human bodies and minds when the job required technical discipline under relentless pressure. The German U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was never treated as a casual posting. It was designed as a highly selective program in which speed of learning, emotional control, and procedural reliability mattered as much as courage. In the years before the war, and through the early war period, leadership around Karl Dönitz tried to shape crews who could keep functioning even when Allied power seemed to dominate the sea. That confidence was not delivered as rhetoric. It was manufactured through repetition. Drills were built to imitate the sensory overload of combat so that chaos, noise, and fear would become familiar conditions rather than a first-time shock. The logic was simple. A crew that has practiced the worst case hundreds of times is less likely to freeze the moment the real world turns violent. That pressure produced a reputation for the submarine service as a special branch, but that image can hide what actually mattered. The real filter was not social status or dramatic language. It was performance under stress, technical competence, and the ability to preserve discipline when a commander demanded speed, silence, and precision all at once. Nowhere were those standards harsher than at the officer level, because a single wrong judgment through a periscope, a single misread of distance and timing, or a single hesitation during an attack run could put an entire crew into fatal danger within seconds. Training pipelines existed to turn naval officers into submarine leaders, including concentrated final courses, where small groups received intense tactical preparation shortly before taking boats to sea. Parallel systems trained men in the mechanics of submarine warfare, torpedo work, engine room routines, battery procedures, and the small valve sequences that separated a controlled dive from a disaster. Even with training, the service could not eliminate human limits. Allied interrogation reports and post-patrol reviews describe a command culture in which tactics were corrected, failures were scrutinized, and commanders who performed poorly could be removed. Older or exhausted personnel might be shifted to shore duties after illness, collapse, or loss of nerve. That matters because it shows what the standards were really trying to measure. The challenge was not simply entering the submarine force. The challenge was lasting. A crew could do everything correctly for weeks or months and still be destroyed by a single aircraft, one escort group, or one mechanical failure at the wrong moment. Under that pressure, the margin for panic was close to zero. Reporting tied to the loss of U-111 describes a moment when command appeared to break down. Orders became contradictory, and the chain of decisions ended with surfacing into gunfire. Whether every detail is remembered the same way across accounts, the lesson remains consistent. When leadership and routine collapse, options collapse with them. As the war dragged on, those pressures intensified. Germany needed more boats and more crews, and training had to adapt to demand. Late war records describe boats sailing with crews who were comparatively fresh, expected to perform complex tasks in lethal conditions anyway. That shift helps explain why standards cannot be understood as a simple checklist. A system can define requirements on paper, but war changes what it can actually enforce. The first standard the system tried to test, then, was straightforward to describe and brutally hard to prove in real life. Repeated evidence that a person could keep working, keep thinking, and keep obeying procedure when the sea and the enemy were actively trying to shatter routine, nerves, and confidence. To understand what that meant, it helps to stop imagining a submarine as a sleek weapon and picture the living space as it actually was. A wartime German submarine was crowded with machinery, fuel, batteries, and weapons, then packed with dozens of men who had to eat, sleep, and work inside narrow passageways for long stretches. The body was tested first because daily life attacked comfort in ways that never stopped. Sleep was not a private refuge. On the captured U-505, there were fewer bunks than crew, so men rotated through shared beds as watches changed. Rest became something you borrowed on a schedule, not something you owned. That arrangement mattered because fatigue was not a one-time event. It was a continuous background condition that shaped everything. Patience, memory, and the ability to perform routine tasks without shortcuts. The mind was tested at the same time because the boat offered little silence, little space, and no clean reset. Museum accounts of U-505 describe diesel fumes seeping into everything, including provisions, until smells and tastes blended into a constant haze, and they describe hygiene as so limited that the mixture of human odor, food, and fuel became part of the atmosphere of every patrol. In that environment, small problems could feel enormous. A headache could turn into a distraction during a watch. A minor sickness could spread quickly through a closed compartment. A moment of irritation could become a conflict you could not escape because there was nowhere to go. Even ordinary tasks demanded patience because there was rarely room for more than one person to occupy a workspace at once. Crowding erased the boundary between work and rest. In many layouts, torpedo areas doubled as sleeping spaces, and bunks appeared wherever a body could fit, because the boat was built to function, not to provide comfort. Air was another constant pressure. Submarines of that era had to balance concealment with the need to refresh the atmosphere, and technical solutions were limited. Late-war approaches to atmosphere control relied on basic methods such as soda lime to absorb carbon dioxide and oxygen candles to restore oxygen. That helps explain why crews could feel drained and foggy during long submergence. It was not simply discomfort. It was an operational constraint that affected attention and reaction time. Sanitation became a further filter separating those who could cope from those who could not. Waste systems at depth were mechanically difficult, and even improvements introduced new procedures and new risks. The well-known case of U-1206 illustrates how a high-pressure toilet system demanded careful sequences and how a mistake could trigger a cascade that forced a boat into danger. None of this was designed to impress. It was the physical reality of a mission that asked people to live inside a machine under conditions that steadily wore them down. By the time a man reached a frontline U-boat, the Navy expected him to think less like a passenger and more like a technician who could respond to system-wide failure in darkness and confusion. The training structure was built to create that habit. Wartime divisions under the submarine command known as BDU existed to form future crews, and documented examples show training organized into major tracks that separated seamanship from technical preparation. That split reveals what the service valued. Seamanship mattered, but survival depended just as much on engines, electrics, valves, batteries, and procedures that had to be executed the same way every time, even when fear was high and time was short. Training did not stop in classrooms. It continued through specialized units that prepared men for the moment a boat became operational. Newly commissioned boats were pushed through torpedo firing training, treated as a standard step before real patrols, with courses described in weeks rather than days. At the officer level, standards tightened further because tactics and judgment could not be improvised at sea. Future commanders went through a final course where small groups received concentrated preparation shortly before taking boats out. Often described as about 4 weeks in length, with roughly 10 to 12 officers per class. These details are more than administrative trivia. They show why the U-boat service tried to reduce uncertainty by turning decisions into rehearsed routines. The most unforgiving routine was the crash dive. A slow or confused dive could mean a boat was caught on the surface by aircraft or escorts. Training regulations emphasized practicing crash dives under aggravating conditions, including drills where systems were already in use and even scenarios that required reversing course. By surfacing after a dive had begun, war diary entries reflect the same mindset, recording crash dive drills and flooding and draining practice as normal discipline rather than emergency improvisation. Interrogation reports from captured submariners also point to broader pipelines that ran through formal naval schooling and torpedo schooling at Flensburg, underlining how heavily the service leaned on instruction as well as unit training. Yet standards were never immune to the pressures of war. As losses grew and resources tightened, German sources acknowledged that programs changed. Extended training became harder to sustain, and time for preparation shrank. That shift did not remove the demand. It simply increased the cost of mistakes. The final standard could not be proven in a classroom because it only emerged when the ocean turned into a trap and the enemy began to close in. In real operations, submarine crews faced a contradiction that became harder each year. The boat needed to surface to move quickly, recharge batteries, and refresh the air, yet surfacing made it visible and vulnerable. As Allied anti-submarine warfare improved, that contradiction turned into a daily crisis. Long-range aircraft helped close the mid-Atlantic air gap by 1943, leaving fewer stretches of ocean where submarines could travel without air attack. Escorts improved detection and coordination through radar, better teamwork, and direction-finding equipment that could locate the general bearing of a radio transmission. That mattered because wolfpack tactics depended on radio reporting, and every transmission increased the risk that escorts would converge on the sender. Intelligence changed the fight as well. Declassified accounts describe how ultra-intelligence derived from German naval communications influenced convoy routing and helped Allied forces concentrate against submarines rather than search blindly. By the spring of 1943, these forces converged into a turning point the submarine command could not ignore. In May 1943, during the period later remembered as Black May, losses rose sharply while results fell, and Dönitz issued orders that pulled many boats away from the main North Atlantic convoy routes. The strategic meaning was not only that the Allies had better tools, it was that the U-boat force was losing experienced crews faster than it could replace them, and experience was the one asset training could not manufacture on demand. For the men inside the hull, the final filter was psychological as much as technical. Under pursuit, crews might spend long stretches at low speed, listening, conserving power, and trying to keep the boat quiet, while air quality worsened and fatigue accumulated. When attacks came, they came in waves, and survival depended on routine rather than emotion. Isolate damage, control flooding, restore power, and keep discipline while the hull shuddered under the explosions. The penalty for error was severe. Many historical summaries cite that roughly 40,000 men served in German U-boats during the war, and about 28,000 were killed. A catastrophic loss rate that underscores how unforgiving this environment became for its own personnel. That is why the standards mattered, not as mythology, but as an attempt to keep human performance stable inside a system designed to fail violently when small mistakes compound. Taken together, these standards were never a checklist meant to look impressive. They were a practical response to a form of warfare that punished weakness in minutes and exhaustion over weeks. Selection mattered, But endurance mattered more. Life inside the hull tested the body with cramped space, fumes, stale air, and limited sleep. Training tried to turn fear into routine, because a crew that follows procedures can keep a submarine alive long enough to fight, and discipline was treated as a form of survival, rather than a matter of pride. The sea did not reward bravery without control, and it did not forgive panic. By 1943, the balance shifted sharply against the U-boats, and danger to crews rose with every patrol. The purpose of this story is clarity, not admiration, to examine how a wartime institution tried to shape people for extreme stress, and how that effort collided with the growing reach of Allied air power, detection, and intelligence. If you want the next episode, tell me which part felt most punishing and why, whether it was the living conditions, the training discipline, or the psychological strain of pursuit. Share this video with someone who enjoys careful history, subscribe for the next chapter, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the continuation of the series.